For as large a facet of human capability as dexterity is, it is often sorely underappreciated by those of us who have had the good fortune of being born with functional pentadactyl hands. Of course, I don't need to explain to you how much of a boon the opposable thumb and malleable hominid hands have been to hominins, the rest of the great apes, and the primate family at large. You could argue it is, in a sense, directly responsible for many of the behaviors that make us human. But perhaps all the glory should not be bestowed solely upon the skeletal structure of the primate hands themselves. After all, a number of physiological characteristics combine to grant deftness of limb. The robustness of upper arm musculature, mobility of the shoulder and elbow joints, pliability of cartilage, the programmability of the nervous system in recruiting individual muscle cells, among many others. But one contributing trait in particular is often neglected despite its disproportionate importance. This trait is the humble fingernail. Distal nail beds stamped into the tail end of each fingertip of a healthy human hand produce sheaves of keratinized plates innervated with their own dedicated blood supply. These shimmering plaques provide the hand with a number of enhancements and utilities. One of the most obvious advantages of possessing fingernails as opposed to their portlier, clunkier cousins, the claw, is that fingernails do not inhibit the gripping and handling of objects. A sharp beam of keratin protruding from each digit would make it much more difficult, if not functionally impossible, to gently and capably manipulate objects using the hand. Not to mention the fact that mammalian claws are often present in the center of every digit on the hand, whereas fingernails are situated above and slightly before the very end of the fingertip. This provides tactile working surfaces which can be used to interact with objects and the general surroundings of a creature. However, if the fingertips were instead skewered with centrally positioned stakes, this would obviously hamper the ability of an organism to grasp an object while still keeping it intact. Also, a feature of the hand which typically comes part and parcel with the claw, although not always, is the requirement of a rigid, unbending plane to be present throughout the body of the hand. The hands of claw-wielding species often cannot bend and manipulate themselves very gracefully in the transverse plane. They're often quite fixed and incapable of flexing. A good example of this is cats. If you've ever seen a cat stretching, you might also notice they sometimes flex their paws ever so slightly, only being capable of moving them up or down a centimeter or so at a time. Any movement that does occur in the digits is largely horizontal. What you would probably never observe, however, is a cat which can completely fold its digits into its palm and form a fist. You probably won't be seeing your dog do this anytime soon either. The reason for this limitation makes sense if you think about it though. A flat, rigid and fixed distal limb makes for a much better force application tool than a flexible, easily distorted one would. Imagine trying to cut the flank off of a steer using a knife with a gelatin handle. It would likely be a poor substitute for a knife with a strong, inflexible, oak-bound handle. Fingernails, perhaps even more so than claws, provide valuable protection to the fingertips. These tough sheets of keratin can shield probing fingers from cuts, scrapes, bangs, etc. The secondary protective function of fingernails is a priceless one for a dexterous tool-using ape when considered from an evolutionary point of view. The claw-using creatures can afford the lesser protection their implements provide them, as the preservation of highly sensitive and tactile fingertips is not really a concern for them. The sole application of their fingers is to impart deadly force to an adversary or prey item. They stand to lose scarce little if sensitivity of their fingers becomes impaired from damage or wear. However, a species as reliant on tool use and the deftness of their hands as humans are, cannot afford any compromise on their ability to acutely feel and precisely manipulate the world around them, as it is an enormous part of their ability to survive and thrive, therefore justifying the development of protective sheaths to shield their sensitive fingertips. Apologies for the poor enunciation there, I can't really say sheaths, whatever. Now, it may seem paradoxical that the fingernail, being an essentially dead and unfeeling implement, could lend itself to the amplification of the tactile response of the fingers. But this is in fact thought to be one of the primary functions of the fingernail. It serves as a sort of sounding board through which vibrations and other sensations could be captured and reverberated out throughout the body of the fingertip. The nail can also provide a counter-pressure to the finger, facilitating a greater application of force in the direction of the finger pad perpendicular to the plane of the nail. The force-generating capabilities of the fingers would be greatly reduced if there was no nail present on its opposing axis. The nails can also act as imparters of force themselves, even more precise than the fingertips themselves can be. Although this does sometimes require you to be a bit of a scruffy git. You see, the nails can be used to perform extremely delicate, small-scale actions which the fingers would be largely unsuited for, such as attempting to pluck a hair, for example. However, when it comes to answering the question of how and why primates evolved fingernails, it is important to emphasize that these efforts have largely been speculative and mired in uncertainty. Numerous evolutionary theories have been posited which could explain fingernail evolution. For the purposes of this video, I will cover the theory which seems to have the most support at the moment. It is clear from the fossil records that the modern fingernail structure which can be observed on most species of primates descended from an original claw-like implement. The ancestors of primates, despite also being somewhat arboreal, would likely not have been as acclimated to life in the trees as their blunt-fingered descendants would become. A contributing factor to this lack of arboreality was the fact that they still retained their claws, which were not quite as well suited to maneuvering amongst the thin, small diameter branches of the trees in the areas that they were only beginning to inhabit. This was due to their having previously lived in arboreal environments with thick-limbed trees which were able to support the anchoring of large claws into their branches. The fragility of the wispier branches present in this new environment posed a challenge for the increasingly arboreal primate ancestors. As a result, the development of more dexterous hands which sported fingernails at the end of each of their distal digits allowed their descendants to thrive and in many cases rise to the top of the arboreal food chain.